Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into Article 4 of Professor Antonio Francisco's incredibly fascinating series on functional underdevelopment. Now, if you've been following along, you know we're looking at a deeply structured, rigorous framework. But today, we're taking a major step forward. We are building an instrument, a tool to definitively tell the difference between a country that's just experiencing a normal economic dip and a country that is fundamentally blocked from fixing its own problems.
So let's kick things off with a rather provocative puzzle. Recently, in 2024, an author named Vikas surveyed the United Kingdom. He looked at its stagnant productivity, the widening regional inequalities, the deteriorating public services, and he came to a pretty stark conclusion. He argued that Britain was essentially sleepwalking toward irrelevance, becoming what he called a third-world economy.
But we really have to ask ourselves, is that right? And honestly, more importantly, is that analytically useful? Does throwing around a dramatic, heavy label like Third World actually help us distinguish between a country with early, fixable institutional fragilities and one with a completely paralyzed system? Well, the short answer is no. Just knowing that a system is failing isn't enough. We need a precise diagnostic instrument to figure out exactly where it stands in that failure.
To build that instrument, let's do a super quick recap of the 3 interdependent failures we covered previously. These lock together to create a single mechanism of corrective blockage. First, we have the failure of critique. Think of Karl Popper here. This is when effective criticism is either silenced or totally ignored. Second, the failure of explanatory quality, drawing on Deutsch. This is when a society just accepts shallow excuses instead of demanding rigorous, hard-to-vary explanations. And third, Taleb's famous warning, the failure and exposure to the costs of error. Basically, the people making the destructive decisions don't pay the price for them. The public does.
Now here is where it gets really interesting. We're going to take those 3 failures and cross them to create 2 distinct diagnostic axes. The horizontal axis measures the blockage of corrective mechanisms. So combining Popper and Deutsch, when the system recognizes a problem, can it actually circulate criticism and fix it, or does it just absorb the blow with zero effect? Then, the vertical axis measures perverse functionality. This is Taleb's territory, and it asks a darker question. Who actually profits from the dysfunction? Are there organized groups extracting wealth precisely because the system is broken?
By crossing these 2 axes, corrective blockage on the bottom, perverse functionality on the side, we create 4 entirely distinct structural configurations. This gives us our empty matrix. It's the structural spine we're going to use to plot specific cases and see exactly how systemic decline operates in the real world.
Let's start in the bottom left. We'll call this quadrant 3, or Q3. This represents normal relative decline. In this space, you have low perverse functionality, and the corrective mechanisms are mostly intact. It doesn't mean everything is perfect. Real problems absolutely exist here, like shifting demographics or political fragmentation, but the system actively debates those problems and responds to them.
France and Germany perfectly anchor this quadrant. In Q3, development remains the rule, and systemic blockages are just tractable exceptions. The crucial thing here is that the costs of error still manage to reach the people making the decisions, which forces eventual course corrections.
Moving over to the bottom right, we hit Q2. This describes a severe but recoverable crisis. Here, a system is creaking under extreme pressure, and it is paying highly visible, painful social costs. But, and this is key, the structural capacity to correct isn't dead. The system is still rationally reacting to the crisis.
The Greek economic crisis from 2010 to 2015 is our empirical anchor for this quadrant. It shows us that while the economic shock was truly massive and the dysfunction was high, distributive capture hadn't completely paralyzed the possibility of correction. So, when the shock eventually passes, a QI2 country has the ability to return to normal.
Now let's look at the top left, QIV incipient capture. Honestly, this is the most analytically demanding zone of the whole matrix. Why? Because it represents the critical entry point where capture begins. Cost asymmetry is growing, meaning a few specific groups are starting to heavily profit off the dysfunction, while the public foots the bill. But the window for institutional correction is, technically, still open.
And the United Kingdom is our central case right here. Remember that opening quote about the UK's housing crisis and regional inequality? The UK proves that you can have a massive, glaring gap between diagnosing a problem through endless white papers and actually executing the reform. The blockage is settling in, even if the formal institutions look perfectly intact.
Finally, we reach the top right. QI, consolidated functional underdevelopment. This is a highly stable mode of perverse operation. Distributive capture has fully crystallized. The corrective mechanisms are totally neutralized, and the dysfunction itself, it is highly, highly profitable for the people in charge.
In QI, we find empirical anchors like Mozambique, North Korea, and Cuba. Now, these represent different flavors of this deeply consolidated blockage. Some, like North Korea, are hermetic, entirely closed off to the world. Others, like Mozambique, are porous, meaning they actually rely heavily on external donors to sustain their dysfunction.
So, this brings us to the very heart of the argument. That opening quote from Vikas, it confuses these two states. The UK is absolutely not in QI, it is in Q4. Now, the UK and Mozambique do share the exact same underlying mechanism of capture, that architecture where fixing problems harms protected interests, but they are in completely different stages of the disease. The difference lies on that Deutschian axis we talked about, explanatory quality. In the UK, the press is totally free, the courts function normally, and opposition parties are highly active. Reports multiply, debates are everywhere. This proves that the failure isn't cognitive ignorance, it is a structural decoupling. It's the gap between knowing the problem and actually executing the fix.
If you take away just one thing from this entire analysis, let it be this. The system knows what is wrong. It does not correct. I'll say it again because it's the nerve center of Francisco's argument. The system knows what is wrong. It does not correct. A democracy can be totally open in its expression, yet structurally blocked from self-correction because real reform would disrupt highly concentrated benefits.
We can even see this very mechanism pulling on South Africa right now. It sits as a borderline case on this matrix, actively transitioning. It's moving from being a formally intact democracy in Q4, heading straight toward the consolidated functional underdevelopment of Q1. And this is exactly why this matrix matters so much. It gives us a precise instrument. Without it, trying to compare the UK to Mozambique or South Africa would just seem absurd, right? You'd be comparing incomparable countries. But with this matrix, we can objectively compare distinct structural configurations of the exact same mechanism of decline.
This analytical framework brilliantly sets the stage for our upcoming explainers. Next up, we're going to rigorously apply this matrix to South Africa, looking at how a formally intact democracy enters QI. And then we'll examine Mozambique, exploring how external dependence itself becomes a part of the mechanism of permanent porous blockage.
I want to leave you with this final crucial thought. The matrix does not predict trajectories. A country can move backward or forward across these quadrants, but we now have the tool to recognize the subtle slide into decline long before it crystallizes. The system knows what is wrong. The real question is, will we build the capacity to act on it before the window for correction permanently closes?